Good morning. I'm Lauren Reese, and on behalf of my colleagues at the Wilson Center and our partners at the Society for Environmental Journalists, I'm thrilled to welcome you to today's event, Environmental Journalists on the Frontlines of Democracy. For those of you visiting the Wilson Center for the first time, I'll say just a quick word about us. The Wilson Center is a think tank mandated by the U.S. Congress to bridge policy, practice, and research. We are home to about 15 programs that focus on every corner of the globe and today's most pressing issues, including the Indo-Pacific Program and the China Environment Forum, both of whom are partnering with us on today's event. The program I direct, the Environmental Change and Security Program, works to connect insights at the intersection of environment, health, and security to foreign policy and international development. This Friday, May 3rd, is World Press Freedom Day and will, for the first time, have an explicit focus on the environment through the theme, A Press for the Planet, Journalism in the Face of the Environmental Crisis. Environmental journalists around the world are increasingly under attack as they document illegal natural resource exploitation and its impact on people and the environment. But this is not just an environmental issue, as I think many of you know. As you'll hear from our speakers, the environmental journalism plays an important role in rooting out corruption and organized crime and exposing abuses of power. I want to thank Megan Parker, our moderator for today's event. I had the pleasure of working with Megan during her 15 years at the Wilson Center before she left to serve as the executive director of the Society for Environmental Journalists. When she stepped out of the role at SEJ in December after 5 years, we wasted no time in welcoming her back to the Wilson Center as a fellow. Megan's commitment to elevating the importance of environmental journalism is really the driving force behind today's event, and her ability to tap into the amazing network of people doing this important work has made this event possible. So thank you, Megan. Before we welcome our panel to the stage, I'm so pleased to welcome another giant in the field of journalism to the stage. John Sawyer is the founding president and CEO of the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, which funds independent reporting on critical international issues and supports educational initiatives in the U.S. and abroad. John founded the Pulitzer Center in 2006 after a 31-year career with the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and after 18 years at its helm, he is stepping down. Under his leadership, the Pulitzer Center has seen a tremendous growth and impact. Projects supported by the Pulitzer Center have won numerous awards, including the Pulitzer Prize, Peabody's, Overseas Press Club, and SEJ Awards. More importantly, reporting supported by Pulitzer grants have exposed corruption and crime, documented environmental degradation, and changed laws and lives. John is a 3-time recipient of the National Press Club's Award for Best Foreign Reporting, has won top investigative reporting prizes, and his work has been honored by the Overseas Press Club and the Inter-American Press Association, among other organizations. John, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the stage.
Thank you, Lauren, and thanks to the Environmental Change and Security Program and the Society of Environmental Journalists for organizing this important conversation in advance of World Press Freedom Day this Friday. Thanks also to the Wilson Center for all that it does and for the support of so many here over the past 2 decades as we have worked to make the Pulitzer Center a venue for reporting, engagement, and learning on some of the big issues that affect us all. Environment is arguably the biggest, most existential of all, notwithstanding the horrors of Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan, and the tensions with China and within our own country. We are already seeing the consequences of unaddressed climate change, the loss of biodiversity, the relentless pressures from increasing population, and the inherent contradictions of unfettered capitalism. We're also seeing the pressures in covering this crisis on journalists and on journalism. In an era when the legacy media model is broken and most news organizations lack the resources they need to expose abuses, trace supply chains, and hold corporations and governments accountable. We saw this firsthand 2 years ago this June when we brought 100 environmental journalists from across the globe to Washington for our Interconnected Climate Conference. On the first morning of the workshop preceding the conference, we learned that Dom Phillips, a British journalist working with The Guardian based in Brazil, and someone many of us knew, had gone missing in the Javari Valley, along with Bruno Pereira, an indigenous rights activist. In this photograph from the conference, we're holding signs with images of the two and text saying, "Where are Dom Phillips and Bruno Pereira?" By the end of the conference, working with the members of the Amazon Advisory Committee of our Rainforest Journalism Fund, we had approved 4 emergency grants for journalists to investigate what had happened to Dom and Bruno and to continue the work that they had begun. Within a week, we knew that Dom and Bruno had been murdered. In the months that followed, the stories we supported with Agência Pública, Reporter Brazil, and others helped expose the law enforcement and policy failures of the government of Jair Bolsonaro that set the stage for the murders. They detailed new efforts by the indigenous tribes of Javari Valley to protect their lands against exploitation by illegal fishing and drug trafficking. And a documentary by Reporter Brazil, centered on our grantee Daniel Camargos, a veteran Brazilian journalist who had worked closely with Dom, showed the toll this work takes on everyone involved. Now, Megan Parker asked me to make this talk in part because she knows that we're in the process of selecting a new leader for the Pulitzer Center to succeed me this summer. And she thought it might be interesting to hear my reflections on environmental journalism during my nearly 2 decades at the Pulitzer Center and for 3 decades before that at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. I heard a talk last month by Ron Chernow, the great biographer of Hamilton, Grant, Rockefeller, and more. He recounted the surprising fact that as an undergraduate at Yale, he never took a history course, and that maybe that lack of background made each of his projects more compelling, more fresh to him. Well, as it happens, I also went to Yale just after Chernow. I took a lot of history courses and plenty of English literature, but not a single course in science. So naturally, my first big project at the Post-Dispatch was a 6-month investigation of our country's failure to develop a safe, permanent solution for the disposal of radioactive waste from nuclear power plants. That led to similar long projects on the problematic futures of oil and coal, and to reporting on President Jimmy Carter's bold embrace of solar power and renewables, and on Ronald Reagan's equally bold reversal of those policies after his election in 1980. I hope that my lack of background in these complex topics made me a better translator for the broad public I was hoping to reach. A few years later, in 1986, I had my first experience in rainforest, traveling with Chico Mendes, a rubber tapper from a remote district of Brazil's Amazon, who had become a charismatic leader in protest against the cattle ranchers and land grabbers who were just beginning their assault on the world's largest rainforest. Chico was murdered a year later, an early lesson for me in the high stakes and grave risk at play in the fight over vulnerable, valuable land. In 2006, with seed money from members of the Pulitzer family, I started the Pulitzer Center with the idea of filling gaps in coverage of big systemic issues and making journalism the focus of educational engagement in schools, universities, and beyond. The Wilson Center's Rob Litvak gave me brilliant advice from the get-go. An endorsement from Lee Hamilton, then the director of the center, was crucial in reassuring the initial seed donors that this was an investment worth making. In the years since, we've grown far more than I ever imagined, now supporting 200 plus reporting projects each year, partnering with over 50 universities and hundreds of K-12 schools across the globe, with a staff of 60 plus journalists, educators, and engagement specialists now based in 15 countries. The range of topics has been broad and deep, including on the environment. The special issues of the New York Times Magazine devoted to Nathaniel Rich's Losing Earth, Abram Loosgarden's reporting for the Times and ProPublica on climate migration, Ian Urbina's Outlaw Oceans Project, which is ubiquitous in many, many outlets across the globe, multi-outlet projects on the health effects of pollution and of artisanal gold mining, and a recent, wonderful, upbeat series in the Christian Science Monitor on the, quote, climate generation of young people that may yet save us all. One of our most memorable projects, and likely not replicable today, was Ecological Civilization, a convening at the Yale Center in Beijing in 2015 that we organized with lots of help from Jennifer Turner, director of the Wilson Center's China Environmental Forum. That symposium featured Chinese and international environmental journalists, business leaders, academic and religious leaders, and the Deputy Director General of China's Ministry of Environmental Protection. Coverage of the environment has been a constant focus of our work throughout, as have threats to defenders of the environment and to the journalists striving to tell their stories. An early project with Saul Elbine for Vice News and California Sunday Magazine told the chilling stories of radio journalists murdered in the Philippines and local journalists in Cambodia, and recounted the statistics of dozens of journalists who had been murdered or attacked for environmental coverage over the previous 10 years. Gustavo Faleros, now our senior environmental investigations editor, worked with a team at Info Amazonia, Consejo de Redacción, and other outlets on a project that detailed a staggering 1,357 attacks against indigenous defenders of the Amazon environment between 2009 and 2018. The single most difficult challenge we faced at the Pulitzer Center was the kidnapping of our grantee, Michael Scott Moore, in 2010. He was on assignment for The Atlantic, writing about ship piracy off the coast of Somalia. In part, an environmental story, since overfishing by international players was one of the reasons that some Somalis turned to piracy as an alternative means of livelihood. Michael was held for 997 days, and there wasn't a day during those awful months and years that his situation didn't weigh on us as we worked with his family, his friends, the FBI, and others to secure his release. If you haven't read The Desert and the Sea and Mike's other deeply reported, insightful books, I hope you will. Thankfully, we haven't had any other situations as dire as Mike's, but harassment and worse is very much a feature of work in this field. These are just a few of the Pulitzer Center grantees who have been arrested, harassed, or detained themselves, or reporting on those who have, as they've tried to bring stories home on environmental abuses and crimes. Ensuring security for the journalists we support is job one. First, by insisting that the outlets for whom they report take full responsibility. Second, by providing hostile environment training where needed. And third, by insisting that they have security protocols in place and follow the guidelines of safety-first organizations such as a Culture of Safety, or ACOS. We've also done everything we can to foster a community of journalists covering environmental issues. In building this network, we've had tremendous support of foundations such as the Walton Family Foundation, the Loudis Foundation, the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, and most especially the Norwegian government, which in 2018 gave us a multi-year grant for rainforest reporting that allowed us both to build our own in-house expertise and to support an astonishing array of reporting, capacity building workshops, and innovative engagement activities around the globe. The results are really remarkable. 610 individual grantees in 52 countries, 317 reporting projects, 1,720 publications, and 615 different news outlets. In 2020, our colleagues in Norway encouraged us to expand our work to encompass a year-long fellowship supporting cross-border collaborative investigative projects. The Rainforest Investigations Network has been a huge success, a true learning community and a laboratory for collaboration. We've had fellows from journalism organizations across the globe, from El País and Bloomberg, NBC News and Tempo, the Bureau of Investigative Journalism and the New York Times, and the University of California, Berkeley School of Journalism. Projects have included the expose of illegal airstrips and gold mines in the Amazon, the illegal deforestation behind the Southeast Asian nickel mines that are feeding Tesla's battery plants, and royal family collusion in the destruction of Malaysia's peninsular forest. Beginning in 2003, again with Norway's support, we applied this same model, a mix of short-term grants, long-term investigative fellowships, and audience-centered engagement to our work on the environmental threats to oceans across the globe. Additional support from the Loudest Foundation in the Netherlands made possible a special focus in our work on the nexus between climate change and labor rights. And in 2024, we began another 5 years of work on these rainforest and ocean topics, plus a focus on transparency, governance, and supply chains, with the support of Norway, the Betty and Gordon Moore Foundation, and the Loudest Foundation. And by happy serendipity, Ragnhild Eikenes, who's been our champion in Norway, is in DC this week, so she's with us today. So Ragnhild, what I just recounted is work that we've been able to do with your support and your colleagues over these past 5 years and more. A key part of this work has been our international education and outreach team. Pulitzer staff based in the Amazon, Congo Basin, and Southeast Asia, and from those regions, who use our journalism as the basis for engagement with high school and university students, as well as young professionals, environmental activists, and the general public. It's so exciting to see how this work plays out in art exhibits in downtown Bangkok, in-person and online environmental courses in Brazilian universities based in the Amazon, impact seed grants encouraging Indonesian universities to collaborate with environmental journalists, community radio programs, and not least, a comic strip on rainforest environmental issues now in use across 30 high schools in the 4 biggest cities in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It's these communities of learning that make me optimistic and excited about what we can accomplish in the years ahead. At the Pulitzer Center, we believe in what we call the full Pulitzer model. It starts with breakthrough journalism, journalism that goes beyond the headlines to get at underreported or unreported stories that are urgent and relevant. Game-changing resources, the staff expertise that we've built on data and research, as well as a network of past and current grantees and the regional hubs that we built, all of which can take work to a higher level, and audience-centered engagement, a focus from the start on the key audiences we want to reach with each project and the tools required to make that happen. I'd like to conclude in thinking about this World Press Freedom Day devoted to the environment, that the most important lesson from our own experience is collaboration, working with each other to make the most of our mutual resources, to learn from each other, and to focus together on how we can achieve meaningful change. I know that's a major goal of the Society of Environmental Journalism, of the Wilson Center, and of the other organizations who are with us today, the Earth Journalism Network, PEN America, and Reporters Without Borders. It certainly is for the Pulitzer Center. And I suspect for all of you joining us today. My relationship with Dom Phillips, the freelance journalist with The Guardian who was killed in Brazil, was mostly online. I did have one evening with him in Rio de Janeiro, and he took me to a working class neighborhood to hear the Brazilian music he loved. Music was the focus of Dom's early career, in England, and it was music that first brought him to Brazil. He ended up making his life there with an increasing focus on the environment, on threats to the Amazon rainforest, and on the indigenous groups that he believed were key to protecting that vast, irreplaceable resource for the planet. He made multiple trips to some of the most remote, lawless regions of Brazil, but he was not a risk taker. Daniel Camargos recalls that on the trips they made together, Don was meticulous in his preparations, meticulous in devising and sticking to a security protocol. He followed that same routine on his last trip with Bruno Pereira. It wasn't enough. What happened to Dom and Bruno, what has happened to dozens of environmental journalists around the world, are stark reminders that this is dangerous work, dangerous and important. I hope that as we mark this year's World Press Freedom Day with its focus on environmental coverage, we will each do all we can to make sure this work is done as safely as possible. I want to thank you all for being together on this journey and for being here today.
Well, thank you all for coming. And thank you so much to Lauren and the incredible team here with the Environmental Change and Security Program at the Wilson Center. It's so great to be back. This is such a special place for me and for everyone. And I'm just so thrilled to be here now as a fellow, to come back where I worked for many years before leaving to run SEJ. This is also where I first met John, back when the Pulitzer Center only had 3 employees, and then now that it has 60, you can see the growth that he has led is quite tremendous. John and the Pulitzer Center's impact on both journalists and journalism is absolutely unrivaled, in my opinion. So thank you, John, for your inspiring presentation and more importantly, for your decades of service and leadership in the field. I also want to thank our partners at the Society of Environmental Journalists, which is North America's largest membership association for journalists that cover energy and environment. Many of the Pulitzer grantees and fellows that John mentioned are members of SEJ, so I encourage all of you who are interested to consider joining SEJ. It certainly changed my life and my career. Now I'm quite honored to talk today to these inspiring journalism leaders here with us on the panel. But before I get started, I wanted to share a little bit about my inspiration for this event. As Lauren said, this is the first World Press Freedom Day to focus on environmental journalism, which is great, but raises the question, why not earlier? In my 20 years of working in and around environmental journalism, I have observed that it has often been left out and behind of most mainstream journalism. Environment itself was often considered a luxury item, and environmental journalism was similarly considered a fringe or a nice-to-have beat rather than a must-have like business or sports. But today, as we see the effects of climate change all around us, as we strive to remake our economy to combat it, and as we face the degradation of our water, our food, and our air, that is no longer a viable position. We all deserve to know what's happening to our environment and what we can do to protect it. So we need environmental journalists more than ever, and we need to protect their freedom to cover these critical issues in order for them to do that important work. But in countries that depend on exploiting their natural resources for revenue and livelihoods, the environment is not just important, it's fundamental and extremely valuable. And in countries with poor governance, natural resource exploitation often goes hand in hand with crime, corruption, and violence. So information about these issues is not only invaluable, it is also dangerous. Global Witness tracks violence against environmental defenders, more than 1,700 killed over the last 10 years, one every 2 days. And the Committee to Protect Journalists tracks violence against journalists, more than 2,000 killed since 1992. But no one tracks violence against environmental journalists on an ongoing basis. Some of them are lumped into the count of activists or environmental defenders. Others categorized as crime or business reporters instead of environmental journalists. There have been some recent efforts to estimate or assess threats and violence, including a new report from IPI, Climate and Environmental Journalism Under Fire, which I recommend, and a new survey which will be released by UNESCO this Friday on World Press Freedom Day. You can't manage what you don't measure, so I hope one thing we see coming out of this focus is a more systematic and comprehensive effort to track threats, violence, and attacks on environmental journalists so we can better target our support and efforts to protect them. This is critical not just for our environment, but for society, because environmental journalists are, just like journalists covering elections or politics or government, on the front lines of democracy. As Wilson Center Global Fellow and environmental journalist Peter Schwartzstein points out in his article, The Authoritarian War on Environmental Journalism, countries with the lowest rankings on the Reporters Without Borders Press Freedom Index are also among the most vulnerable to climate change. And he argues that this goes beyond correlation, that suppressing information about environmental degradation is a key part of the authoritarian playbook. Exposing environmental injustices in states that depend on oil revenues, for example, threatens the powerful elites. Detailing environmental weaknesses like water scarcity can weaken national security in countries in the Middle East, for example. And increasing public concern about pollution or food scarcity risks inspiring revolution. So as Peter says, environmental degradation appears to be fueling repression, just as the ensuing dearth of coverage accelerates degradation. It's a unvirtuous cycle, unfortunately. So if democracy dies in darkness, so does our planet and our people. So let's talk to some of the people on the front lines of this battle. You all have their bios, but I'm going to briefly introduce each and open with a question about their work, and then we'll dig into the issues. So Amrita Gupta is the senior editor and content officer at the Earth Journalism Network, which works with environmental journalists all over the world. Amrita, can you tell us a little bit more about what threats you see EJN members and grantees facing?
Thanks, Megan, and thanks also for organizing this very important conversation. Just a little bit of background about Internews Earth Journalism Network. For those of you who may not be familiar with us, we've been working for over 20 years to support a global community of environmental and climate journalists. We've supported over 16,000 stories with direct support. We've trained over 15,000 journalists, and that's with the sole mission of boosting this very important coverage of climate and the environment. And we've also seen that this work has an impact, and because of that, we've seen that journalists face threats. And just a few examples of those threats, you heard also from Pulitzer Center, you heard from Megan, but from our experience recently, we supported a journalist in Guatemala who was reporting on illegal logging, and he had people come to his house and demand to know who his sources were, and they threatened his family. In South Sudan recently, we had a journalist who was reporting on illegal gold mining. And he sent us footage of him and his colleague, and they were being chased on a motorcycle from where they were reporting and threatened. And this intimidation is everywhere. Sometimes it takes the form of cyber attacks or digital security threats. Our media partners in Indonesia, they were reporting on coal oligarchs in the country, and they were then the victims of a DDoS cyber attack. and in Vietnam. I think this is also a journalist who's supported by the Pulitzer Center. She had to move to a safe house, and she had to report under a pen name because of the work that she did to expose government kickbacks to a wood pallet company. So these are just, few examples, recent examples, and we know that these are not isolated examples. And I want to share that, in fact, we also believe that monitoring this and tracking this is key to actually doing something about it. So in next few months, we're actually just about ready to launch a new research report called Covering the Planet. And in fact, it's the most ambitious study, as far as I know, of the state of climate and environmental journalism worldwide. So we commissioned researchers at Deakin University in Australia. They incorporated input from, I think, over 800 journalists worldwide in over 100 countries. And those findings there are really remarkable, and I'm going to be very eager to share those with you, but I want to focus today on the findings related to safety. And we found 39% of journalists that they spoke to said that they sometimes or frequently experience threats as a result of their work. That's more than a third. And that same percentage said that they frequently had to self-censor themselves as a result of this intimidation. And we found, similar to what you all mentioned, is that a lot of these threats are coming from those who they encounter who are practicing illegal activities. A lot of this is increasingly moving online. A lot of it is gendered violence. And increasingly, it's using the judiciary to silence journalists instead of safeguard them. So gag orders, SLAP, legislation against public participation. So we found that 30% said that there were threats in the form of legal intimidation. So that's an alarming finding.
Thank you. And when is the report coming out?
We want to launch it on World Environment Day in June.
Okay,
but
great.
Yeah, looking forward to sharing that. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you, Amrita, for that summary and preview of some of the data that you're finding. Next, I want to turn to Sandhya Ravishankar, who's an investigative journalist based in Mumbai, India, and who's joining us via Zoom. Sandhya's coverage of sand mining in India exposed her to threats. Can you tell us a little bit more about your experience?
Sure, Megan. Thank you for having me and for giving me this opportunity to speak in front of all of you. It's been a long 9 years of facing threats. It started in 2013, and thankfully it sort of tapered out by around 2022. But living under constant fear and anxiety has taken its toll, and I'm really glad it's now over. The story that kicked off this situation of extreme threats, the story was about rampant illegal mining of beach sand minerals from the southern coast of India. Now, first, it started off with rape threats, and then the mining mafia issued press releases to media organizations across the country. And trust me, there are many, many media outlets in India. They sent out press releases alleging that I was corrupt, that I was, blackmailing them, and that I was, cooking up false stories to extort money from the miners. Then they issued a press release which stated that they had hired 5 private detective agencies to stalk and photograph and videograph me. And they used the might of their political clout to slander me in an official government report. A couple of strangers attempted to set my motorbike on fire outside my residence. Luckily, they failed. And the miners also instigated a member of parliament to hold a press conference in which I was called a criminal mastermind and a sort of handler of 2 French journalists who were labeled as French spies, who had come out to steal India's nuclear secrets. And of course, 2 of my Indian journalist colleagues who had accompanied the 2 French journalists who were working on the same story, they were illegally detained by the police for 2 days, and there was literally no support available. Our effigies were burnt by the supporters of this member of parliament who who decided to issue threats on behalf of the miners. Now, the police functioned as an extension of the mafias themselves, not a sole help, despite many, many complaints made to the police. Fellow journalists, too, came under the sway of the mining mafia. Some of them, decided to look the other way. Some of them were convinced about the lies that were being spread by the mining mafia. And apart from a precious few, pretty much everybody turned away. And thanks to the lies and to the claims of, of the miners that I was being stalked, I was being photographed, I was being videographed, I was being spied upon. There were photos and videos of me meeting various sources that were put out on blogs. My sources and people in government, officials who would otherwise have met me and given me a lot of information and important documents, all of these sources now began to avoid me. So the isolation was basically the punishment for reporting on illegal beach sand mining. It was a complete isolation for almost a decade. And if you look at it, an isolated journalist is literally worth nothing. And because in my view, it's the biggest punishment that can be given to a journalist. Imagine you have no friends who you can call. You have no friends who can make calls on your behalf when you're in trouble. You have literally nobody to turn to when the book hits the fan. There are no reporters who are going to stand up and say that this is a violation of press freedom, this is harassment of ABC journalist or XYZ journalist. There's nobody to really give you a voice or support you when you're being unjustly vilified and harassed. And even worse, there are no sources and no officials, nobody really wants to talk to you or be seen with you because they're afraid that they might be photographed or videos of them meeting you might come out into the open. So there's no information coming in either. So not only what I'm actually trying to say is, taking up a difficult story like this, it has severe consequences. And not only is your personal safety and liberty under question, but your entire career sort of goes into a tailspin. And I think this in itself is a deterrent for a lot of young journalists who really don't want to go down that path, that very difficult path. And yes, this was my experience, and I'm sure many others have had similar, if not worse, experiences. And I'm really happy that we're talking about this today at this event on World Press Freedom Day. It's a conversation that has been pending for a very long time, and I must thank the Wilson Center for holding this.
Thank you, Sanya, for sharing that difficult story. I have to ask you, how did you persevere through all of this?
It was, I think, more than anything else, I did not want the miners to win. So it was just a lot of grit. Of course, my family supported me. There were a few journalist friends, a few very good lawyers, a few, bureaucrats, politicians who supported me, all very quietly behind the scenes, but they did help. And it's only due to the will and the support of these few people that you managed to pull through.
Well, certainly your grit comes through. I really appreciate you sharing story with us. I'm going to turn to Clayton Weimers, who's the Executive Director of Reporters Without Borders, USA. RSF has a long history of tracking press freedom and threats against journalists around the world. So I wanted to ask Clayton what he's seeing specifically with regard to environment and how it compares, to journalism in general and other beats.
Yeah, so in many ways, the challenges and threats to environmental journalism and the reporters who cover environmental beats mimic a lot of the other challenges that we see in press freedom, particularly when covering conflicts, for example. But there's also quite a few unique challenges. First, you mentioned in your introduction that environmental coverage is often seen as a luxury, a nice to have, not a need to have. And that is reflected in the quality of coverage that we see. Newsrooms tend to see environmental journalism as less profitable than other forms of journalism. Yet we know that these stories are of vital importance, and we also know that the public understanding of issues like climate change is not nearly at the level that it needs to be to confront the problem. There was a survey done by Axios a few years ago that found that environment and climate change was rated as the second most important topic by their newsreaders. Yet when it came to traffic, environmental stories ranked far lower behind things like national security or entertainment. The conclusion that the media drew largely from that report was that news consumers are hypocrites. That may be the case, but I think there's also another possible explanation, which is that the media is not adequately serving the public right now and not doing the kind of coverage that the public craves and that it's telling that the media outlets it wants. So why aren't we able to get quality media coverage on the environment? Well, there's that aspect that a lot of newsrooms see it as a luxury. One of the reasons that it's seen as less profitable is that it's really expensive and really hard to do. These stories are often involve chasing down leads in very remote places in faraway parts of the globe. A lot of these stories exist on private land that is inaccessible to the public, owned by companies like mining conglomerates or logging corporations, and that can be particularly tricky. Journalists are often also up against very well-funded adversaries. And that can create a whole host of problems when it comes to access as well as to safety. They're also up against a sea of disinformation. It is simply hard to get the truth out about these stories. All of these problems are necessarily interrelated. But just to come back to the problem, we know we're not getting enough quality news coverage on these stories. There was a study done by the University of Colorado about the heat wave that hit the United States in the summer of 2018. And it analyzed 120 television news segments about that heat wave. Of those 120, one mentioned a link to climate change of that heat wave. That just underscores the problem. So the threats that we see, like I said, similar to other threats in journalism, underfunding, coming up against well-heeled adversaries who will fight tooth and nail, who have good connections to the government, who have good connections to the courts, and who are able to weaponize those apparatuses to their advantage. But in many ways, those threats are amplified when it comes to environmental journalism.
Thank you so much, Clayton. Yeah, I think the underfunding, because it is expensive and hard, is a critical challenge that those of us working to support environmental journalists have faced, and organizations like the Pulitzer Center are trying to help fill that important and challenging gap. I'll turn to Gigi Mohammed, who is Senior Manager for Digital Safety and Free Expression at PEN America, where she focuses on online harassment, a growing threat, particularly for women and people of color. And Gigi has generously helped SEJ members protect themselves from online harassment. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. Thank you so much, and thank you for organizing this event. My background, in a way, led me to this field. I worked as a journalist covering human rights abuses in Egypt and the Middle East for a while, and then I shifted into the safety and security field because of all of the things we've been talking about today. And unfortunately, I mean, very fortunately, actually, I did some trainings with SEJ last year and the year before because of the amount of threats and risks that people are facing. And it's not necessarily taken seriously by a lot of newsrooms. And some of these things that happen is you have climate deniers, you have other groups who just disagree with what environmental journalists are reporting on. Then you have general hostility towards journalists in general, no matter what topic you're covering. And all of these things are making it very, very hard for people to do their jobs. And the problem is also that not everyone is facing the same threats or for the same reasons. In our work, we always see that people from historically marginalized communities, women, if you are a member of the LGBTQ communities, if you are a member of, specifically if you have like an identity that is visible, it's very hard for you to do your job because people are targeting you online or offline, first because of the job that you're doing and the topics that you're covering, but also because of who you are. So there is a compounded like trauma and attacks that keep happening, and it's becoming hard and harder for everyone to do their jobs, and also to retain the people that journalism industry have long really struggled with keeping when it comes to diversity in this field. Some of these things that happen are, we see a lot of doxing that happens, targeting people, which is the publishing of personal sensitive information about someone without their consent, and is to intimidate them. Then we see campaigns of impersonations, campaigns of like hateful speech and hateful attacks. Then we also see things like hacking, stealing information, using all of these information to blackmail someone or the journalist so that they can leave the profession. A lot of things that have mentioned earlier are very, very important to have in mind, and specifically a couple of things that John said earlier. One of the things that we try to work on is to help newsrooms and nonprofits and organizations set up best practices and policies in-house so that the response to all of these attacks is not ad hoc, but it's actually something that is systemic and that you can track and you can support your journalists, not only staff, but also freelancers. Another thing is I am a co-founder of another initiative called Aegis Alliance, and we create and tailor HEFAT trainings, hostile environment first aid trainings, for journalists, human rights activists, which, as said previously, some of the environmental journalists are not only counted as journalists, but sometimes in other countries counted as activists or someone that is working on corruption. So I think we need to have also a better understanding of what definitions we're using when it comes to environmental journalism, because depending on the country you're working in, that will differ massively. And I think we really need to understand that. We also need to understand that whatever we're talking about when it comes to journalism, maybe in the US or in Europe, will not necessarily be applied in other countries around the world. And that's something very important to keep in mind.
Yeah, thank you for that reminder. Context is everything. And thanks for sharing some of the actions that PEN America and yourself are taking to protect journalists. And I wanted to ask the same question of Amrita and Clayton. How does EJN help protect its members of its networks and its grantees?
Yeah. Thanks, Megan. As Gigi said, context is everything, and it's hard to prepare journalists for all eventualities, depending on where they're reporting, what they're reporting on. So for the past several years, what we've been doing is really try and take a case-by-case approach, which is, on one hand, trying to prevent threats from occurring and trying to prioritize a safety-first approach, and then trying to deal with reducing those threats when they are encountered. So one thing that we do is every single grantee that we have, we pair them with a mentor. So that's usually an experienced journalist from that region. And specifically for freelancers, that's huge because they don't have any kind of support without a newsroom. But with under-resourced newsrooms, we also find that mentoring allows the journalist through the whole reporting process to have someone that they can, not just get editorial support, but safety advice, touch base before they go out on the field, share emergency contacts, check in every day, have a contingency plan. And we found that actually makes a huge difference. In the Amazon, our team has specific protocols. They're like safety, like risk assessment checklists that they work with before granting any journalist that they work with. And often these take the form of sort of trainings as well, which could be courses that address both digital safety and physical safety. Before they even step out, and working with environmental defenders, especially in indigenous territories, it's very, very key to have this constant contact. And then when we support fellowships, for instance, the recent climate summits in some countries where there's more high risk and security risk, we've ensured that fellows sort of interact using a VPN or encrypted messaging, just basic sort of safety hygiene practices. We have to take it case by case, as I mentioned, because it is so varied. But then once journalists do encounter a threat, we have to, this is where the power of networks and collaboration comes in, because that's when we try and connect them to, we've connected journalists to Committee to Protect Journalists, CPJ, Reporters Without Borders. In some cases, when the threats are of a legal nature, we've connected them to groups like Media Defense, an international senior lawyers project. So those groups help provide pro bono support in the countries that the journalists are working in. And many times it's also local organizations are working on the ground to safeguard journalist safety. And so at that time, those local connections really come into play. And so, that the journalist that I mentioned earlier in Guatemala, who had people come to his house, we discussed with him, and we really took the lead from the journalist, where we ended up supporting a home security system for him and his in-laws' house, because he felt that was what they needed now that they knew where he lived. In some cases, it's funding so that they can travel to a safer location, or that they can just, go in a group to report rather than go individually, because it's expensive and it's usually in remote regions, like you said. So essentially, sometimes what happens is we have to make sure that we're supporting in terms of protecting anonymity, so not announcing names in grants or something like that. But sometimes it's also valuable as an international organization to bring visibility and to bring that recognition about what's happening in spaces like these. And that often also helps with recognition and bringing more visibility to these specific cases.
Thank you. In the IPI report that I mentioned earlier, one of the recommendations about the relative invisibility of environmental journalists, particularly those that are freelance or working in remote regions, it says membership in journalism organizations and networks can increase visibility and should be encouraged. So to your point on all of the many groups that you mentioned, as well as I'll put in another plug for SEJ, is a one component of a safety approach. Clayton, I wanted to ask you the same question. How does RSF work to the steps that it takes to protect journalists?
Sure. We do trainings all around the world to help keep journalists safe. We outfit journalists with PPE and other equipment and digital safety tools. But in addition to doing all of that great work to get journalists ready, we know we have to do more, because as John said in his introduction, you can take every precaution and still wind up the victim of an attack of some kind. You can't protect against everything. And so to really make a difference, we need to go further with advocacy, and we need to increase the quality of the rule of law in many of these places. But we also need to recognize that this isn't just a problem in faraway remote lands. It's a problem right here in the United States. It's a problem in our neighbor to the north in Canada, where reporters are frequently arrested while covering protests over indigenous land rights, over the construction of pipelines. There's actually a legal case in Canada right now that RSF is helping support. Amber Bracken is a journalist who was arrested and detained for 3 days, arrested while she was covering a protest against a pipeline being built in British Columbia. But we have a serious problem where police can't distinguish between protesters and the journalists who are covering the protests. And that extends beyond environmental problems. But we know that we need to do a better job of advocating for stronger protections for environmental journalists, and we need to create stronger legal resources to protect them after the fact as well, particularly when it comes to defending against SLAPs, strategic lawsuits against public participation. We need to foster strength in networks, because we're all stronger when we're working together. Networks and associations that provide support and visibility and collective protection against threats and harassment, and that necessarily involves partnerships with locals on the ground. It is essential that any journalist who is going in to cover a story that is outside of their own backyard partners with locals who understand the terrain. And we need to do a better job of advocating to the governments to facilitate access to the information that is necessary. So often these stories require access to information that is closed off or that is privileged to private companies, yet is in the public interest. And so we need to create better legal avenues for reporters to access the information that we all need to make better sense of the environment.
That's a great reminder of the importance of advocacy and coalitions. And one sort of bright spot, at least in the U.S., is the Press Act, which is passed with bipartisan support in the House and is now pending in the Senate. And that act is designed to protect journalists from government surveillance. So it's nice to see some across the aisle collaboration on this important topic, but yet it is just one of the threats and facing journalists, and of course just in the U.S. So we do need to do a lot more work in the U.S. and around the world. Gigi, I wanted to ask you specifically about the mental health effects of covering these issues and dealing with the harassment that often accompanies it, and how PEN America approaches that challenge.
Sure. It's unfortunately, with everything that is happening, it's leading to a lot of high number of burnouts. There was a report that was published by APA, I think last year, that they talked about how the journalism industry has a higher rate of burnout than doctors, which is very weird. Like we know the amount of hours, the number of hours that doctors spend working. If we have that happening in the higher in the journalism industry, we are in trouble. And the other thing that was also mentioned earlier that is important to keep in mind is that younger journalists are now less inclined, younger, like journalism students or younger generations, less inclined to go to journalism schools because of what's happening. And this is related to many things, the risks, the hazardous risks that come with being a journalist, specifically environmental journalist, the lack of support by newsrooms, lack of understanding of the effects of everything that is happening to journalists and how it's affecting their mental health. So we see burnout, we see people leaving the industry, we see a high number of depression, PTSD. Part of the work that we do, we provide journalists with trainings, and we do some incident response work as well, so that when journalists are in trouble, they reach out to us, they call us, and we do incident response. We try to support them in many different ways. And in these trainings and while doing these incident response, it is really heartbreaking to see the things that journalists go through. I was a journalist at a point in my life. I am kind of a journalist at this point as well. But it is very hard because if someone is constantly receiving horrible, horrible threats, rape threats, as was mentioned before, racial slurs, and all of these things, almost every single day, because of the work that you're doing, I will not understand, and a lot of people will not understand, how can they continue doing their work, specifically if there is a lack of support. And I'm very grateful to be in this panel with all of these wonderful people, because I know that all of these organizations are doing a wonderful job to support journalists. And I have always been a big fan of the Pulitzer Center and the work that they're doing, because this is what we need. We need to continue doing that. And one of the things that we also do sometimes is we're trying to figure out a sustainable way for journalists to seek support. And we just published this report about peer support in the journalism industry. And it was kind of, we studied several different peer support networks that exist within other professions, like the medical society, or like, for example, with paramedics and other professions. And we're trying to figure out a way, how can we actually set this up for the journalism industry so that people can seek support? And the problem is the existing avenues are really wonderful, but for some reason, journalists actually do not end up talking about, for example, the online harassment and online abuse they're receiving. And because there is a stigma within the profession itself that online harassment has not been considered as a serious or real threat till very, very recently. And there was a study done by ICFJ and UNESCO, I believe, about online harassment. And 70% of women respondents, it was globally, actually, global study, and 70% of women journalists have responded and said they have faced harassment during the course of their work because of their work when it comes to online harassment. And 20% of these respondents have said that online harassment were actually linked to physical harassment and physical abuse. So this idea that online harassment is contained on your phone or on your laptop, it is not true. We're seeing it increasing now. That is actually linked to also physical attacks that can lead, in a lot of cases, unfortunately, to death, injuries, and all of other horrible things. So this is unfortunately the reality that we have, but we provide a lot of support, and I'm happy to talk to anyone after the panel as well if they need anything.
Thanks for sharing that. A while back, SEJ had partnered with the DART Center on a survey about the trauma engendered by covering climate change, and we asked them to include some questions about online harassment. And it was interesting because this was a couple of years ago, and there was some reluctance or pushback, as you said, of saying, well, online, that's not real. That's not like, it's not like covering a war or something, you know. And I think that goes with this, you know, the longstanding sort of macho culture of journalism that, you have to tough it out, which leads to overlooking the particular vulnerability of women and journalists of color and LGBTQ folks to online harassment. So thank you so much for that correction. I do think that people are starting to, as you said, very recently wake up to this, as well as to the ongoing impact of covering issues like existential threats like climate change. But it's still been, I think, individually seeking help is still a huge challenge. Clayton earlier mentioned a number of reasons why, it might be different or more challenging for environmental journalists, particularly, it's very often in very remote areas, or the role of private companies and private land. I wanted to ask the rest of the panel, what are some other reasons that you think that it's different for environmental journalists or potentially more dangerous? So anybody can jump in. Amrita, do you want to start?
I think the other speakers covered it, but really it's key to recognize that the threats are amplified when the journalist is covering environment and climate, and it's less prominent than, say, a conflict reporter or a political reporter, and so they don't have the same kind of resources from their newsroom necessarily, or from other external support. And we need to recognize also that there's this sense of urgency, right? Because we all know that this window of opportunity is closing. And so necessarily that response against the threat that journalists pose, bringing accountability and bringing sort of an engaged and informed public, that response is going to escalate. And so we have to react sooner than we are doing right now.
There's also an issue with how polarizing, especially climate change coverage, can be. There's not a lot of topics that journalists cover where simply covering them is controversial. There's a lot of polarizing topics in the news between wars and racial justice, but when you cover climate change, you get pushed back simply for acknowledging its existence.
Yep.
Sandia, I wonder if you said you've covered both environmental stories and non. What do you see as the differences in your experience?
Sure. I come from a country where there's a pretty large gap between income gap between the super rich and the really poor. So many times in a country like India, in a developing nation like India, it's a toss-up between natural resources, protecting natural resources and conserving them, and uplifting the livelihood and lives of people who live in utter poverty. So it's local populations may not support the story that you're trying to do when you're talking about conserving the environment, because they need those jobs. So, for example, if it's iron ore mining or bauxite mining, people in that area, they need those jobs because otherwise they would be living in utter poverty. There are governments which come to power in the country on the promise of creating jobs, on the promise of generating wealth, and these are important goals as well. And these are goals that we cannot lose sight of. These are important as well. We end up as environmental journalists who are writing about exploitation of natural resources, exploitation of perhaps wildlife, illegal wildlife trade. These are issues that may not really be very, very popular even among local populations, even among what we generally see as underdog populations, tribals perhaps, people from very, very poor sections of society, because they need this exploitation to continue in a sense. So, in fact, in many cases, even the depressed classes, the tribals, they could very well be the perpetrators of various types of wildlife crimes or environmental crimes. For example, the tribals of a region called Varasanadu in India, where they are very, very skilled elephant poachers. So we do stories about these tribals, and you're going to have a pushback from the local population. You're going to have pushback from governments as well. And at the end of the day, we do some really, really unpopular work. But this is uh, precisely why it needs to be done. And like Clayton said before, I definitely do believe that advocacy needs to be, at the core, at the forefront of what organizations like RSF and CPJ are doing, because what we actually do need, what we environmental journalists on ground actually do need, are these journalist associations and bodies who are speaking in a non-confrontational manner to governments in order to help protect us. So I think Clayton was spot on in saying that advocacy is the need of the day.
I want to add, sorry, I want to add one more thing. Is one other thing that is we see a lot with specifically environmental journalists is that there is a sense of doom around the topic itself, and like everything is ending, and that's very hard to deal with every single day, because like if you report on a conflict and you leave that conflict, you definitely get affected emotionally and maybe physically as well by it. But you're removed from that situation, you're removed from that environment. But if you cover the environment and there is this sense of doom and helplessness consistently, it is very hard and it can be very traumatizing for people. And that's one of the things I see unique and very relevant specifically to environmental journalists.
Related to that, the IPI report pointed out that journalists are often among the first responders to disasters. So they get to, not only see and experience these terrible impacts on people, but also often don't have the same kind of training or resources that, say, other first responders might have in terms of how to protect their own safety in that environment. Or their mental health resources to deal with it. I have so many more questions, but I want to turn to the audience and hear your questions. So there's my colleague has a microphone, and please raise your hand over here in the blue, and please state your name and affiliation, and questions, please, no speeches.
Hi, my name is Renata. There's a little button on the bottom there. My name is Renata Janina. I'm a fellow here at the Wilson Center for the Environmental Change Security Program. I work with environmental defenders in the Amazon, mostly women. including Angela Mendes, daughter of Chico Mendes that John mentioned in the beginning. And the kind of threats that they face are distinctly different from those of men. I know Gigi mentioned a little bit more, but they often are invisible as well. It's not only that there are sexualized forms of threats, but there's even like domestic violence because they take a more prominent role that women are not supposed to take. So I wanted to ask you about that, and also about the protection training programs and how that's taken under consideration, not only of women, but also other intersecting identities. And my last question is, I thought was very interesting, Clayton, that you brought up the advocacy, and then the colleague in India, I'm sorry, I forgot your name, also mentioned, because it has to do with prevention. But I wanted to ask, beyond that, how do you communicate the importance of press freedom for our collective, for our society as a whole? Because a lot of these people, what happened to Dom and to Bruno in Brazil, it's the work of criminals, but a lot of these harassers, they are people who just, I don't know, don't understand that importance. So that's, my question. Thank you.
I can say that, like, for example, what you said is very important. Thank you for bringing that up. One of the most important things that we can do when working on safety is that intersectional lens. I personally believe, other than the identities, actually, like, we need to be very aware, and our work need to be focused around identity-centric approach that is also trauma-informed to safety, which is what I believe in. The other part of it is the different cultural aspects. Like, we need to be culturally aware about where we're working and who are we advising. Because as you said, like, there is a gender aspect, there is a lot of different things that we need to have into consideration. The type of advice, risk assessment, or trainings that I create for people in the US, it is not the same that I used to do in Egypt or I do in Egypt now. Because so many things. We, like, for example, in the US, for now, and I hope it lasts, that we have laws that protect journalists. That being said, we have also a lot of risks that we're not really necessarily talking about a lot, that we need to discuss more. So whatever advice I will give to someone here, it will be very different, because I understand also how the situation in Egypt or in Gaza or in other countries is. I need to understand that, for example, we might have laws that supposedly protect journalists, but the reality of it, that is not the truth. So that's why, for example, you mentioned risk assessments earlier, and that's why it's important. We need to understand the environment we're operating in. And one of the things that we're trying to do is to create a more identity-aware and trauma-informed safety scene in general, which is, as we know, like, most of the field in the safety and security was created by British ex-military, ex-police enforcement white men. But now we're trying to implement more diversity, or like try to reach more diversity in the field. And you also need to do the same thing with this in the safety and security field, because it's not a cookie cut approach. Like, you need to tailor it, understand the gender aspects in different countries. The way I cannot give a specific advice to the situation that you just mentioned, because I will need to know more information about what's happening exactly, and I'm happy to talk about that later. The other part that you mentioned as well about advocacy, I do agree. We are in trouble because we have a lot of right-wing rise around the world now, which is also increasing the hostility around journalists. So with the advocacy, we do a lot of different advocacy around, like, journalism in general. Like, it's important for democracy. We need these things. It's important for human rights. So you need to find which audience you're talking to and kind of tailor your message to them. But also that we try to work also with, for example, social media platforms, and advocate that you need to create features and tools for journalists and human rights defenders so that they can really mitigate or deal with the online harassment and campaigns that they're unfortunately put through. So I think there are so many different levels, and I know all of the wonderful organizations that are doing that work. It's an ongoing effort.
And to your very good point about public awareness, there's sort of a chicken and the egg problem here, where the media needs to do a good job of explaining these stories, but it is threatened from doing so because there's a lack of awareness about the stakes of these stories. There's also an element of media literacy that needs to be addressed. Like I said earlier, perhaps no topic is more susceptible to disinformation. And so what non-journalistic organizations like RSF or like governments can do is to really invest in media literacy so that people have a better time distinguishing truth from fiction. But I think that also misses another aspect of this, which is there's a threat from the general public towards journalists in these cases sometimes, not because of a lack of awareness, but because this is actually a threat to their livelihoods. So we talked a lot about how powerful business interests might target journalists who are covering environmental stories that might impact their businesses. But it's not just the threat from the people with all the money. It's also the threat from there's also a threat from people on the ground who have a lot to lose genuinely because these are their jobs, this is their livelihood. And that is a much more difficult problem to get around.
Yeah. And just to add to that as well, we need to recognize in every activity, every piece of work that we do with journalists on the ground, that the approach that we bring has to be tailored, because it's not just women journalists who are facing these unique challenges and women environmental defenders, it's also women sources and women in the way that they consume news differently. And so we need to address these differences when we're doing any kind of activity on the ground, and even with training. It has to be very, very centered with a sort of gender transformative approach, because there's no point going out there and saying you're going to do all of this training and then not reaching the women journalists where they need to be reached. Internews has a program called Safe Sisters, which is focused specifically on the threats that women face online. And how they can ensure digital safety, because as we know, it escalates very often to real physical safety. And so that's one example, but agree there's so much more that we need to be doing to recognize that we have to center different lived experiences. In that report that I mentioned that we're releasing soon, we saw that non-binary identifying journalists said that they faced more threats. And so it's not just women, we need to be more intersectional in thinking of any vulnerable group and marginalized community.
Thank you. Reminder to our online audience that you can submit questions via the chat. Let's take one more in the room. John?
Great, thank you for the excellent presentation. I'm John Sawyer at the Pulitzer Center. I had a question for Sandia and maybe for the other panelists as well on how can we most effectively support environmental journalism in countries like India that are increasingly restrictive at the government level of journalism. And that, what we've seen in the last 10 or 15 years is that much more difficult to get a journalist visa to go to India. 10 years ago, you could go on a tourist visa and pretty much do what you wanted and explain later. You can't do that. It's much more difficult to do that today. It's hard to get into India. But for the Indians, so we've done more and more support of Indian journalists in India, which is incredibly important. But they're under a lot of restrictions as well. And one of them is, there are laws on the books, as I understand it, in India, that if you have support from non-Indian organizations, the Pulitzer Center, Earth Journalism Network, whatever, that you can be subject to prosecution yourself, and that's rarely enforced, but it hangs over the head of journalists. So, and this is happening in Russia, China, Turkey. There are more and more places around the world where the governments are proactively moving to restrict how journalism is conducted. So how do we, as outside organizations, work effectively to support the journalism that's done?
Sandia, do you want to go first?
Sure. That's a great question, because you're right. The laws are, continually changing, and while there are very relevant reasons for these laws to be changing, it also hinders our work as journalists in a big way. Like you said, an independent journalist like myself, for example, cannot take a grant from, say, a Pulitzer Center or any other organization from outside the country to maybe do a journalism project on the environment, whatever it is. So a journalist basically can only get paid from abroad if he or she is a foreign correspondent, an India correspondent for a newspaper or a television network outside of India. So otherwise, journalists like myself who might be eligible for grants, they are not. We are no longer supposed to take any grants or monetary support in any fashion from outside the country. So that, of course, restricts us from working on, like you were talking about, these 6-month projects, these 1-year projects that really make a difference. Those are those doors are sort of close to us. How can you help is a great question, and I'd like to expand on the point I was making earlier about advocacy. Now, if you look at how the Western media is viewed in India, in countries like India, and like you said, other countries, Russia, China, perhaps many other Asian countries as well. The Western media organizations, as well as the Western media associations, like perhaps the CPJ and the RSF, other organizations, they are viewed as being inimical to the country's interests. So they are viewed by various people in power as trying to push a particular agenda through the use of money, funding, etc., and trying to push a particular agenda which is against the interests of the country itself. So this is a sort of a paranoia. It may or may not be true, but it does exist. And for the kind of reactions that I have seen is that people tend to rubbish this and to say that this is ridiculous. Why would we work against India? Why would we fund stories that go against Indian interests? It's both sides have legitimate points, but the problem is that neither of them is talking to each other in a constructive manner. And that is where journalists, not only environmental journalists, but a variety of journalists, they get stuck in the middle without any support from either side. Because both this side wants to help, the Western media, or perhaps the RSFs and the CPJs, they do want to help, but they are unable to have a conversation with our governments because perhaps they think you guys are right wing, perhaps they think you're dictatorial, perhaps they think you're being ridiculous by saying that we are anti-India, whatever it is. But at the end of the day, there is no dialogue happening. And I think that dialogue needs to be established, and it has to be established in a very, very constructive manner, where I would love for a Clayton or an India representative of RSF to be able to actually go up to the relevant minister in a state in India and speak to them and tell them that XYZ journalist is facing problems because of this. Can you please help? And the minister would actually be in a position to respond positively and to ensure that help is provided in a proper manner, which benefits the journalists and their families. Because it's not just the journalists who are at risk; it's also their families. Today, I don't think a CPJ or an RSF or even any of the Indian press organizations, the press associations, I don't think they're in any position today to go up and meet a minister and to meet the relevant minister and make such a demand and ensure that it actually gets done. And this is where the gap lies, where we have these very stark political views. I think political views of journalist organizations and their representatives need to be set aside. It doesn't matter whether the government is liberal or leftist or right wing. It really doesn't matter. At the end of the day, it needs to be a practical approach where journalists' safety is guaranteed. And I really hope that not just RSF and CBJ, sorry, I'm picking on those two because, you guys are top of mind right now. But I'm saying across the board, all press associations, bodies that represent journalists, I definitely feel that they need to have dialogue, initiate conversations that are practical and we have positive outcomes from them.
Thank you. I do think that it is challenging for journalists to do the kind of behind the scenes sort of lobbying and diplomacy that what you're asking for requires. But I think it's something that we need to do, or we need to find partners who can do it. If it's hard for us culturally, and our approach is generally more to put people on blast rather than work behind the scenes. But you're right. Other folks want to address John's question? Folks? Okay, we have one more question here. Lisa Palmer?
Thanks so much. I'm Lisa Palmer. I am a research professor of science communication at George Washington University, and I also am an SEJ member, a longtime environmental journalist. I co-authored with one of the co-authors of the UNESCO report on women and their, I guess, digital, I can't remember the exact title of it, but the online violence against women journalists. So I co-authored a research study with Sylvia Wasteboard, one of the authors of that report, and I found, the science threats and online for science journalists facing these threats as well, and that newsrooms are really doing little to help them. And so, I'm really listening and hearing the sort of the need for advocacy here, and some of the would like to see, like, what specific policies would you like to see advocated? I'm looking for some new research to pursue, and potentially how, what could we start to think of as these kinds of advocacy policies are needed, and who could implement them in this area of civic engagement? Because, as you said, we're really beginning to see the need for this. We're seeing the need to be able to shine our journalism skills onto these areas, but if we are at the same time seeing so many people drop out or self-censor as a result of these attacks, our newsrooms aren't even able to stand up for us. And whether you're freelance or even employed by an organization, you are isolated because a lot of folks are remote. Is co-working and a part, of building community, or some ways to being, together, so people are not so isolated here. So, like, what could be a suite of approaches here? Because I don't think it's just one approach.
I want to piggyback on that with one of our online questions that's related. Noor Gantus, reporter for Sierra Magazine, asked what can publications do to support journalism to make conditions safer. So in addition to Lisa's question about specific advocacy approaches, what are some steps other than ones we've already talked about that maybe editors and news outlets can do? I'll open it up to you. Gigi, you want to go first?
I can talk about, like, also specifically newsrooms, because advocacy can take many forms and in different things. You can do advocacy with governments, you can do advocacy with employers, which is a huge thing. You can do advocacy with nonprofits. It depends on, like, your approach. I would like to focus more honestly on newsrooms and employers in general, because it's heartbreaking when journalists get attacked because of their work and their identities, and then go and find lack of support. So you talked about earlier, Megan, about, like, we have this macho attitude in the journalism industry about, like, being thick-skinned. I can do all of this. Yes, great. But also, we need to understand and acknowledge the harm, so that if we want to continue in this field, we need to acknowledge the harm. And I think this cultural shift that we need to have in newsrooms is very important as a first step. The other things that newsrooms and employers can provide: trainings, resources, whether that's for digital threats, like, for example, data scrubbing services, honestly, mental health support, like whether subsidized or for free if possible, like fostering and funding peer support networks. There is a lot of things, technical things that can be done. But also, if we have all of these technical things and generally lack understanding of the threats or acknowledgement of how serious they are, I'm not sure how effective that will be. So we have to do both. We have to try to, which is happening slower than I would like it to be, but it is happening. Like the culture itself is changing slightly around understanding more of the threats, acknowledging that online harassment is also harmful, not only physical harassment, and like how all of this is linked together. The other thing is like we cannot treat security concerns in silos. We cannot say like this is an online harassment problem. It's not physical or it's not mental health or legal, because all of these things at the end of the day, they intersect together. Whenever a journalist reaches out to us, one of the things that we do when we do incident response is that we talk about what's happening and try to pull it apart into which actual risk is this. Is this legal, so we can like connect people to the right avenues? Is it online or digital, so we support in different ways? Is it physical safety concerns, so these are the things that you need, or we connect them to other organizations? And the problem is that if you are in the middle of a campaign, it's very hard because like you're kind of being traumatized. It's very hard to know exactly what the risks are. And sometimes you just need to talk to someone that can help you pull apart which risk is that and how can we support it. I really, really think that as an industry, newsrooms and employers definitely need to do more and definitely need to support the journalists and specifically freelancers.
Advocacy when it comes to journalism can sometimes be a very thorny subject, and not just because of this culture of machismo in the newsroom, but also this old school idea that journalists never want to be the story and they never want to be in the spotlight and they want to maintain their objectivity. And that is admirable, but I think it is okay to take a position on the safety of journalists if you yourself are a journalist. I think it is okay to take a position on the future of the profession. I don't think that compromises your objectivity. And I think that's another culture change that might be slowly happening right now, but it's worth noting that a lot of journalists are still very uncomfortable with putting themselves in the position to ask for things of governments or of law enforcement agencies. And so RSF, organizations like us, can be unequivocal in making those demands, but it would be great if we could have a few more folks from the journalism community itself doing so. And maybe that is most appropriately done through organizations like the Society for Environmental Journalists or the Society of Professional Journalists, something like that. I don't have all the answers there, but that is one aspect of it. To your point about more concrete steps on advocacy, we talked about the Press Act a little bit earlier, and that's by no means a panacea, but it is the single most concrete step that Congress could take today to improve press freedom in this country, because it would put barriers between journalist sources and law enforcement and prevent courts or police officers from compelling a journalist to divulge their sources. Another thing we need to do more of is advocacy with law enforcement at the local level. There are not adequate policies in place in most police departments for how to deal with journalists in the field, and that is evidenced by the fact that we've seen 2 journalists arrested in this country in the past week at the protests against the war between Israel and Hamas. And finally, on a more global level, I think we need to better develop protection mechanisms for journalists. RSF published a report a year, maybe a year and a half ago at this point, analyzing 4 of the protection mechanisms that are in place in Latin American countries and seeing where they fall short in places like Mexico and Brazil. And these are very admirable policies, but they're often not designed, or should I say tailored to the very unique needs of journalists. They tend to be borrowed from strategies that have been successful for human rights defenders or human rights activists, but don't necessarily always apply to the unique threats that journalists face. So I don't need to get into too much detail, but you can go to rsf.org and you can read our report on protection mechanisms in Latin America there.
And Rita, we're almost at time. I'm going to give you a minute to respond.
Okay. I agree that there is very much, especially in other countries where we found this approach that journalists must shy away from being advocates, but particularly for themselves as well as for environmental or climate issues, and that does affect sort of bringing visibility to this issue. But maybe then sort of meeting people where they're at, what we can try and support then is, okay, bring that same journalistic rigor that you do to investigating environmental crimes to investigating crimes against your colleagues and your peers, right? Like, let's bring attention to it the way that you know how to do. And maybe we support those kind of stories, just as the Pulitzer Center said you did when Dom disappeared. So I think that is something that we can also do in addition to advocacy, which is key.
Thank you. I'll just put in one plug myself for the fact that all of this that we have talked about takes money. And if there's one thing that journalism industry is lacking right now, it's money. And so funding to support the work of supporting journalists and journalists, supporting journalists themselves is critically important. Look at what we are up against. Look at the powerful, very well-funded folks that Sandia was up against. We are nowhere near in this business at that same level of support or funding. It's a David and Goliath situation at its most extreme. So anything we can do to encourage folks to, help pay for this work will be, I'm sure, returned in full, because if there's one thing journalists are good at, it's stretching a dollar as far as it can possibly go. The most frugal people in the world. So I'm sorry we didn't get to more of the online questions. We will be able to post some answers to them online. So please, thanks to our online audience, and check back there for the video recording as well. And please join me in thanking our incredible panelists and John, and thank you to all of you for coming today. And thank you, Sandia, for joining from so far away, and happy World Press Freedom Day, everyone.